Hello, and welcome to the new series of podcasts that I'm doing for this Lent. For those of you who are joining me right now, and make sure everything's set up properly. Yes, I do apologize. Originally, my podcast time is 6 p.m. PST, which I know is already cutting it a little bit late. I had to rearrange things to actually get things in order tonight, and also to kind of feel out this new format I'm doing. So it is Lent, and as per usual during Lent, I'm not on my main social media feeds. So, I do Substack still. I read the Substack feed perhaps a little bit too much, which is kind of a relapse, but I'm really trying during Lent to stay away from the brain rot feed. And this is it's something that I struggle with a lot because I'm frankly I'm quite addicted to it. But even more than that, I feel like it kind of constrains the conversations that I tend to have. So, just to give you guys an example, for the longest time since I've been doing the Fiddler's Green podcast properly, it's been about 3 or 4 years since I kind of came back from a hiatus and the video essay died. Originally, I was known as a video essayist, and occasionally I would do these streams where I'd answer audience questions, and I call them distant streams or whatever. But in the new iteration of the channel, again, YouTube's kind of dead as far as political content is concerned. It was really around live streaming because live streaming was the only thing that the algorithm really prioritized. And I wanted to I wanted to kind of showcase a lot of different themes on the podcast. I realized early on that people liked me kind of giving monologues. And the thing that people really wanted to hear initially were conversations about discourse. Well, the problem is that this kind of trapped me into basically talking about what was going on Twitter. And as kind of fruitful as that is, this is a politics and culture channel predominantly. It also trapped me into the same kinds of conversations. There was a running stereotype. Oh, what's Dave going to talk about this podcast episode? It will be the death of discourse yet again. Um, and now that I'm off of Twitter or X or whatever it's called, it just seemed fitting to try to do something entirely different, to do a series of smaller streams. I don't know how small this is going to be. This is a Dave stream after all. I don't know what you want me to actually not be verbose and go on forever. But, more than just trying to do a shorter podcast more frequently up until Easter, also try to focus on the things that I I think are kind of valuable in the abstract. We talk too much about what's going wrong. We talk too much about useless drama on Twitter. I know that's what sells, but that's not what people genuinely want. When we look back on podcasts, and I know podcasting is by its very nature a very temporal format. It's a format that is only it's really only engaged in to kind of fill the space. No one really focuses on podcasts. Um, and we all naturally talk about ephemera in them. But I wanted to, as much as possible, try to take on problems that we see, or in specific, I wanted to talk about cultural problems as we encounter them in modernity, and see if we can't think about them productively in new ways. This is the Lenten Restoration series. And really not highlighting things that I object to, but things that I think are life giving and fruitful and that are kind of underexplored. And maybe I'll get kind of into my spiel properly here. But the biggest problem, the problem that everyone seems to be aware of right now, that seems like we haven't really engaged with. We talk about it constantly. The reality of cultural decline. The reality of cultural decline. It was something that was, throughout my life, people used to talk about this persistently. Initially, it was the decline of reading and books, and my father was somebody. It's kind of amazing to think about his life. He was born in 1936 in Europe. 1936. He was, I guess he was 3 years old when the war started, and uh, and he was 9 when it ended, and he was somebody who had a broad view of the 20th century. Now he was a very, I mean, if I said he was a very liberal person, you would assume that he was a progressive, but he was liberal in the classic sense. A classic liberal source, classic liberalism was not as associated with internet cringe um, as it is in the present day. But he had this idea that mankind was on this upward trajectory, and it was all, we was all sunny uplands from here on out, and technology was the key to our salvation. And I noticed that I've cut off this XKCD comic. And, I certainly adopted this to a certain degree, but one little fly in the ointment for him, one chink in the armor for my father was always that, while he saw I mean, he moved obviously from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, from Western Europe to Canada, from Canada to the United States. And this to him was all just a giant upgrade, things getting better. But the thing is that throughout, he was fairly old when he had me as a child. But throughout the time I knew him, one of the things that was always perturbing this vision of optimism was the fact that he was distinctly aware that the culture was in decline. And he would complain about movies all the time. We used to see a lot of movies back in the day. And he would complain about modern novels all the time. He was a bibliophile in the classic sense. After he retired as a professor, he opened a used bookstore. And, you know, originally he opened the used bookstore and said, I only want to sell books that I myself love. And, the bookstore went bankrupt. And then he reopened it with a mainstream appeal, and it did much better, of course. But the thing is that I always used to fight him on this because I, as a child of the '90s, always thought the culture was great. We're living in the golden age of movies. What movie was better than Jurassic Park, or what music was better than the kind of music that we had on the radio? We had the best of all worlds. We had the stuff that came from the 60s and 70s, and then the new stuff that was coming out now, and the technology was really exciting. And it was really easy to kind of just view the progression of culture as, again, something that was not necessarily progressing the same way that technology was. This was not something that was on an obvious upward trajectory. It was not an undeniable good, an undeniable upgrade at every stage of things. The big thing, the thing that was happening was not going to be necessarily the best thing that ever happened, but it was more or less an expanding cultural space. Everything that you had in this moment was the sum inheritance of everything that had gone before you. You were perfectly able to access all elements of culture. And to the extent that old people thought that culture was worse or declining, they were just kind of stuck in their own modes of doing things. They were not really appreciating a reality that you were appreciating. The old people might have some wisdom, but they are wrong about this. And this leads me to this great comic. This came up a few weeks ago, or perhaps a month ago. A month ago, there was this big conversation about the status of art, and specifically the status of conservatives in art. There was this is the halftime show at the Super Bowl. There was Bad Bunny versus the TPUSA running Kid Rock. Now, I recently wrote an article for First Things about this. Hopefully, it'll be published soon. But it summarized my take on the question of conservatism in art. But running parallel to the conversations for why couldn't conservatives properly mock progressives was just a question about, gee, how much of halftime shows declined? We used to go from like the Beach Boys and actually good rock bands, and now we're doing these weird kind of novelty acts. I forget who said this. There's some other blogger said Bad Bunny sounds like somebody just hit reggae beat on a Casio keyboard and then decided to kind of dump a whole bucket full of expletives, of crude expletives in Spanish over it, and then dress it up with some kind of "We Are the World" message. I mean, this the lowest tier slop imaginable, and people love it. It's an international phenomenon. It's not even. I mean, think about international Hispanic or international crossover hits from the before times. I mean, I remember. I mean, I don't know. This is going to be a little bit of a crude comparison. I mean, I remember, wasn't Shakira one of the personalities that did halftime shows before? I mean, Shakira was a crossover hit from Colombia, an act that was very much like Bad Bunny. But I mean, Shakira makes Bad Bunny look like Cole Porter, and Cole Porter looked like Beethoven. The amount of class and skill that went into previous acts of popular music is undeniable. And so, it's just funny because you look at your Substack feed and you try to ascertain exactly what is going on in the world, and everybody is complaining. It's just a long list of declines. When we were in the 2000s, we had understood that, okay, there was a decline in literature, that it was observable. Music was also obviously declining, but this was the golden age of television. There was another media form that was rising from the ashes. And this was, again, just part of the general cultural undulation that we should get used to as modern people, because this is just how things were. And today, it's not like that. Today, everything is just a huge list of things that aren't working like they used to. People remembering what it was like to go to a halftime show and be at a rock concert that actually felt life giving. People remembering, oh, gee, remember when TV used to be actually something that we could believe in? Remember when rock and roll was actually good and felt like it was pushing boundaries? And somebody posted this, especially in the wake of the AI slopification. Everyone now, if we're honest, the media that we interact with the most is the doom scroll feed. And the doom scroll feed is just whatever social media you're on, and you're just flicking it up. And you're hoping to get a little dopamine hit of something that is interesting or unusual. But for the most time, you're also kind of looking at your social media feed, hoping not to see the most horrible thing you've ever seen in your entire life. This week, we started to bomb Iran. And I mean, don't want to start talking about contemporary politics on this stream. This is probably why the stream is not going to get very many views. And I'm probably going to host it differently than the rest of them. But I can't stand looking at modern war. It is absolutely disgusting. It is something that is technologically becoming more horrifying and more detached from human will and human valor by the day. And it is also more lethal and more pointless. The point of any war is completely detached from the line they feed us. At least in Afghanistan and Iraq and the first Gulf War, people pretended like there was some kind of national interest. There was some kind of an idea of patriotism and an identity that we believed in as all Americans. Nobody believes that anymore. Right now, the administration, they're basically telling us that this war against Iran is for another nation's interest that has basically done nothing for us as a country, as far as I'm concerned. Our relationship with Israel is a one-sided relationship where we give them everything and they take everything. And then we pretend like we owe them something more. They give us intelligence, by which they mean they are allowed to manipulate our government, because giving intelligence is an asset and receiving intelligence is a liability. since intelligence controls the policy of the people who are receiving it. If we received our intelligence from China, China would be far the better for it, and the United States much the worse. If China received its intelligence from the US, the reverse would be true. Countries do not receive intelligence from each other like it's a valuable resource. It is something that can be selectively turned on and turned off to manipulate the receiver. But we're not even pretending anymore. This is a pointless war. This is a absolutely horrific war. And to the extent that I'm even on social media, I'm just getting blasted with images and I can't look away. You're just stuck on the doom scroll because nothing is more psychologically addictive than scrolling across a feed that could hit you either with an electrical shock of horror or with this huge kick of dopamine. And meanwhile, all the other cultural forms, every article I read in my Substack is about a different form of decline. And this leaves this XKCD article, which I've totally cut off here. This was going around on the feed too. But if you read through it, I can kind of paraphrase here. And I assume there's going to be an audio version of this. I'll probably release this on the Redwood Society Substack. I think that's probably going to be the best way to do this. But the XKCD cartoon in 1840, the guy is like, modern bookworms are too busy reading and they can't actually live in the modern world. In 1880, 40 years later, it's nobody talks anymore. It's all just newspapers and magazines. And then you go forward into the 1900s and you get into television. Television and radio are completely destroying our social outlets. We're doomed. And then eventually it's the Sony Walkman and the iPad making everyone silent. And then finally in 2015, iPhones. And is XKCD still making comics? This is peak atheist cringe from the 2000s. It was I got a math degree undergraduate, so now I'm the master of the universe. That's the perspective of XKCD, and everyone else who views the universe in a different way is stupid. It had its moments, but there's nothing that parallels XKCD, an unrivaled hubris, because this cartoon has aged like milk. As one commenter said online, every one of those technological skeptics was right, and they only got more right as time went on. The iPhone effectively killed culture in 2015, but it was a coup de grace since the entire endeavor had been declining from that time. And now when we get into 2025, AI is killing culture, not really because it's producing good stuff or better stuff than humans do. Not that I think that is possible based on what art is, but just because it produces this constant churn of low quality slop you can't look away from. Every one of these technological skeptics was right. They had a kernel of truth. And they understood something about culture that we've forgotten. And look, I'm not somebody who is a Luddite, although I don't know. I mean, there's a case for that, certainly. You could argue, and I was reading the Silmarillion to my, I never know how to pronounce that book. I think it's the Silmarillion, but I was reading it to my wife because we had the previous year read The Lord of the Rings. And now we're reading the Silmarillion, and I was thinking a lot about Tolkien's perspective on the world. And what unfolds from the Silmarillion, and and what is kind of important to understand, and this is a perspective that I very much agree with Tolkien in, is Tolkien believed in two things. First of all, he believed that inside Christianity, both the pagan wisdom and the Abrahamic wisdom had kind of met and become one. And this is a belief that I know that many on the right might disagree with me. There are some Christians that would call me heretics for this belief. There are some pagans who would call me a Christ cuck or whatever they say for this belief. But I am very much of one mind with Tolkien, that I believe that in Christianity we see the flowering forth of both the ancient pagan blood wisdom that is, it exists in varying iterations across all peoples, Obviously, there was sort of a Chinese folk blood wisdom, and there was a Hindu folk blood wisdom. I mean, I said in previous podcasts that in many ways Hinduism leaves me kind of viscerally like it's a very disconcerting religion. But it's not supposed to make sense to me, and I can find elements of it that were beautiful in their own time. And Tolkien believed, obviously, that inside Christianity in particular, or perhaps even before that, in things like Platonism or early monotheisms, the two branches of human spirituality came together and became one. And you see that very much on display in the Silmarillion, but also is this belief that everything is a decline from the initial spiritual inception. So in the Silmarillion, God creates the world out of song with help from this angelic chorus. I think they're called the Ainir, right? They're called the Ainir, these angelic beings. This is, again, a variation on, well, it's much more like the Christian origin story than the Norse one, but it begins with order being projected onto chaos. That is, in fact, all origin stories begin with the order being unleashed upon chaos. That is the heart of, first there was chaos, and then came order exploding out into it in light. And Tolkien believed that sort of the heart of beauty, truth, and goodness lay in this initial song. And at some point, the main singer, the godlike being, steps away from or is forced to step away from his creation in some small part, and it becomes autonomous to itself. And this is partially due to the introduction of chaos and flaw and sin into the picture. And at that point, every iteration of culture we have contains less of it, contains a shadow of the holy essence, but it contains less and less and less and less and less. And so, in the first age, the gods walk among mortals, and people live for like 3,000 years, even if they are mortal. And the battles consist of armies of these angelic beings versus armies of demons. And the world is new, and the trees grow up to the sky, and the insect are as big as buildings, and everything is larger, everything is more epic, everything is more primal. And then as things go on, the music of the one god is kind of diminished, and all can be done is repair it, recreate it for the new age. And then eventually, as is promised, there's inside the dissolution and the disintegration into chaos. At the end of times, there is an explosion of order and a new heaven and a new earth. And this is also where, again, Tolkien's vision of creation meets up with sort of his understanding of Norse mythology. It's kind of a Ragnarok meets the book of Revelations. And, I sympathize with this. This is something that I see. And when you look at the hobbits, what's always kind of funny about Tolkien is the hobbits they live in this perpetual, like, 16th century. They live in this perpetual high medieval period just before the Reformation starts. Like, it's just before the 30 Years' War. Just before everything kind of went wrong with the Catholic medieval ages. So, people, whereas everybody else, everyone in Gondor is kind of fighting these battles that are really kind of only native to the Dark Ages or like the fall of the Roman Empire. These existential battles, or there isn't really a firm understanding of legalism or law. All of the hobbits are kind of living at the height of medieval comfort. They have, they're publishing books. They have like these highly cultivated vegetable gardens with varietals that come from the New World. This is sort of the idealistic point of the Middle Ages, and sort of the jumping off part before at least the decline that Tolkien saw in his own society kicked in earnest. And this is what they always say, like that the seeds of the disaster are spread at the civilization's height. And in many ways, Christendom, the old Christendom, was at its spiritual height at the moment of Reformation, at the height of the Middle Ages. Now, obviously, that's what kicked off the scientific revolution. We certainly were not at our technological apex there. But I think Tolkien felt that in terms of connection to the spirit in terms of the flowering of our civilization's spiritual fruits, it was just that moment before the giant contradiction was unleashed that kind of we had our apex connection to sort of the spiritual and the artistic. And it was the height of the early Renaissance. I don't know if you want to draw a line around there, and I'm kind of vaguely waving my hands. And I don't know. I mean, there is. I don't think I believe that exactly, but I can see echoes of it. And you know, when we go through the ages and we go from a world where people live like the hobbits from the Lord of the Rings, and in the hobbits, everything is the natural world and conversations, and then books, but only really books that matter. Books are kind of a rare thing in their world, and music is all played, and entertaining is all local. And when we bring on these things, these pieces of technology, um, we're able to sort of capture and reach heights that were never even conceived of before. And a great example of this, I'd be interested to hear what Tolkien might say about this. And I am kind of painting Tolkien's worldview with a broad brush here. But as anyone will be sure to point out, any Catholic who believes that the spiritual apex of the West was in like I don't know, the early 1600s, 1500s, or whatever. Before, I mean, the Reformation was early 1500s, early 16th century. But I'm being kind of broad here. Forgive me, but what we consider to be, for instance, the height of classical music, that does not begin until, really, if we're being honest, the late 18th century. There's earlier Baroque stuff. We consider Renaissance music or ancient music, as they sometimes say, but nobody remembers the music of the Middle Ages. And I do love medieval music. I do love plain chant. I do love Hildegard von Bingen. I mean, it is nice, but the technology that's unleashed by the scientific revolution allows early modern man to bring this force of his spirituality to heights that he could not imagine. And from that point, you know, it eclipses earlier forms of folk music, but then it starts declining as it gets further from its inspiration and further from its source. And such is the case of all of these technologies. And you could say the same thing about our connection to things like our religion. The faith of the medieval stood closer to the medieval person because there was so much less distraction. And but I guess this is where I'd sort of differ from Tolkien. It is possible for me in imagination to visualize. This is we have XKCD on one hand and Tolkien on the other. It is possible for me to imagine a transition through time where technology and new media forms was introduced non-destructively, where we were able to keep something of the best parts of all of the past. And part of this, I mean, part of manners and part of how we conduct ourselves as a society was organized around developing disciplines to practice art. When you think about something like religiosity or a Bible study, or poetry or music, these were things that people were not really disciplined into doing in their ordinary hobbit like existence. These emerged organically from people's demand for the thing. But in order to preserve what they were, they had to essentially be formed into schools, such that when you get to the 20th century, the reason why people are reading the Bible in Latin, even though it's not originally written in Latin, well, the reason why they're reading it in its original language, the reason why they're engaged in deep Bible study, is because they're literally forcing themselves to do it. They're ignoring the noise of the outside, and they're cultivating the art. Um, this, we call this, there was this. People used to say when people went into things like music, we're holding this in a conservatory. And I always found that kind of interesting. You go to the conservatory to learn music. People people really mock conservatism, the idea of a backwards facing culture. We're going to restore the past. We're going to conserve the past. Modern man looks at these things and he scoffs at them. Oh, well, culture should always be forward looking. Culture should always be embracing the radical feeling of the moment, and that is true to a certain degree. But I mean, think about us now. We have no time for conservation or restoration. Yet everything is kind of, we're not looking into the future at all. We're constantly paralyzed by nostalgia. We don't even really believe in a future. It I'm saying this clumsily, but part of the way of practicing culture is in a constant state of conservation and restoration. I think it's a little bit more plainly in front of us right now, but no media can beat a Skinner box in terms of its ability to placate people. I probably don't need to say this to people. I mean, and this is not something that, it wasn't like, lest you think this is a modern problem, but for people who don't know, Skinner boxes are what it was, this invention of a psychologist in I don't know, it was in some kind of applied medicine field, but they were doing experiments on rats, and they realized that while cocaine was very, very addictive for rats, the only thing that was more addictive than this highly addictive substance was a little machine called a Skinner box, where if the rat pressed the button, sometimes he'd get the cocaine and sometimes he wouldn't. Meaning that the rat would desperately be pressing this box all the time because of the stimulation of the uncertainty itself that would in many ways drive the demand towards using this. And that's what we say, Skinner boxes are what are stand-in these days for these hyper stimulating forms of media that are at the same time uh, impossible to put down and impossible to outcompete. I mean, your doom scroll on your phone is the perfect example of a Skinner box. Sometimes it's a reward, sometimes it is a huge punishment. And as we all know now, you can't beat the Skinner box. At some point, you have to erect boundaries around it. And this is something that, again, I think we've kind of retconned history. The story we tell ourselves now is that at every point in history, the media that people actually used and participated in was the most stimulating experience they could possibly get. But no, it wasn't, right? I mean, there were drugs and alcohol. I mean, there was not really high-powered opiates back in the 19th century, but there was opium and there was alcohol. There were people who wasted their lives away on their very own drug Skinner boxes in the 19th century. And that wasn't allowed. That was looked down upon. The only reason why people disciplined themselves to actually have a life that had thickness to it was they were able to erect boundaries around it. They were able to say, this type of media is preferable and should be practiced, and this other type of media needs to essentially be curtailed. Um, and the thing is, I think when you do that and when you look at art, not as something, I guess this sort of curtails our modern notion is we are competing in a free marketplace of pleasure, of delivering pleasure and stimulation to customers. But that is not what art does. That is not what art can be expected to do. Art is, and this is the core, I'm kind of butchering the article right now, not least because I'm having to do this live. Art is an expression of aspiration. The people struggle to find a definition of art, but I have a very good working one. A piece of art is anything that attempts to use beauty to bring you to valuing something that is higher, that is good and true. So if you're using beauty, or maybe we're using broad beauty sort of broadly, right? There's a certain beauty of ugliness and repulsion too. When you see things like Goya, if you're using beauty or aesthetics to bring people to a higher truth or to an aspirational good, that is art. And the whole problem with art right now is it has nothing to do with stimulation. It has everything to do with our relationship to it. There is no art without a concept of sacrifice. And because of that, there is no art without discipline. Furthermore, there's no way to separate art from our identity. This is something that progressives understand that conservatives have entirely missed. I don't think I really had time to cover it in the writing I've done about this topic. But people always try to shy away from these feelings, these deep feelings of identity in the modern world. We're afraid of them, we're repulsed by them. And there is something very, very disturbing about including on the nose political messaging into art. It is deadly to it because politics is something dirty. Nevertheless, identity isn't. And of course, like all things, politics is essential because politics is what you can't look away from. Politics is violence. It's literally the most stimulating thing you could possibly interact with. So, in some sense, your identity is political. But identity is deeper, identity is more fundamental. And art cannot be separated from the identity of the artist and the identity of the patron or the identity of the consumer. It is in some ways a transference of life energy. It is a sacrifice on the part of the painter to impart something to the viewer so that in the communion, the viewer can be brought to something, brought to a level that's higher than he was before. And this is one of the great struggles. This is one of the reasons why, no matter how good AI art gets, it can never be AI art, or it can be, well, we can quibble over what counts as intelligence, but it can never truly be art because there is not this communal relationship where the artist is sacrificing to elevate the viewer. That is the fundamental, there's sort of a reciprocal process here, right? That the viewer and the person who is engaging in the consumption of art has to discipline themselves and cultivate the ability in their mind to receive a message that could potentially be challenging. That requires discipline. The artist has to reach into their own soul and their own perception of the universe and take what is the most valuable thing from his perception of the universe and harness it in as truthfully and as honestly as possible, put it in front of the audience in some way where they can understand it. It is a mutual meeting of minds. The sacrifice of the artist meets the disciplined, and openness is the wrong word, but trained receptivity of the patron. And that is what builds in the mind of people collectively and individually a sense of goodness that is the basis of identity. And so, it's a highly personal task, and it has nothing to do with consumption. It has nothing to do with stimulation. It has nothing to do with doom scrolling is about as far away from art as you could possibly get. It is the anti-art. It is the purely optimized algorithm. Something that I was listening to Dudley Newright on his podcast today, and he had this really flattering call out of a few things that I said on his podcast. I think it was actually Isaac Simpson who said this. But when we look at political movements like our own in the modern age, we are right wingers. It's, this is a misnomer, obviously. We could say the distant right. The problem with the distant right, broadly speaking, is that it's an entirely negative movement. It's a movement comprised of people who reject progressivism in its 20th and 19th century forms, pretty much in its entirety. If you consistently reject the progressive understanding of the world, which includes many elements of the liberal world, then you are essentially a right winger. But that's only something, an identity that's created by subtraction. It's purely negative. That's why when you do opinion polls of right wingers, again, it's like a cloud. And when you do opinion polls of left wingers, they're all clustered. And, part of it is because, part of it these days is because progressives are mostly women or men who think like women, and women are high in trait agreeableness. They're high in the big five personality trait agreeableness. So they always agree with the consensus, But the other thing that causes the clumping up of progressive ideas into this little ball, this orthodoxy, is progressivism is one worldview. And right-wing ideas are just the rejection of that worldview. And so one thing is, we were talking about why the right wing has a hard time cohering. Now, one of the problems is the fact that we do not yet have a common identity. And I think everyone kind of understands that. That is sort of common knowledge in our spheres. The other really big thing, and this is one of the reasons why I've been so interested in real life meetups, but also in community building. Again, community building online is the most fake, pretentious thing you could possibly do. But having community, like it's weird. Like talking about community building is pretentious, but actually building the things, actually doing the work, actually laying the green shoots, it's hard work and it doesn't show results, but it's the most essential thing. Because more than identity, what the right wing lacks and what causes it to constantly shatter every time it comes in contact with something that looks like it might be a victory is the fact that the right wing has no praxis. There's no way to take the principles that you believe in and embrace as a right winger. And again, the problem also is that those are mostly negative beliefs. They're mostly rejections of the less understanding of the good. And Catholics have our own understanding, and so do pagans. And there is some kind of overlap there, but it's not consistent. But what really hurts the right wing is that there's no ability to take what you have been talking about and put it into praxis. The reason why art is so essential for the right wing to understand and to cultivate and to restore in this present moment, and the reason why I'm doing this series, is because art is the core human praxis that is not directly either work or war or worship. Actually, probably that's the four human practices: work, war, worship, and art. I really wish that I could work, war, worship. Those are three W's. I could really do it well if I had a fourth W for art. I can't think of one off the top of my head. But it is the core communion of self-expression, of spirituality through self-expression, and the communion of people collectively in a non-personal in ways that I guess can be highly personal and are highly personal, but are sort of parasocial in that sense, right? They're parapersonal sounds like a terrible word, but art is the praxis. A right wing that can master art will master praxis. If you master praxis, you will have an identity. If you have an identity, you will have an actual sole alternative to the disastrous path that progressivism in the modern world has the human race running down right now. And it's so difficult. We know something is in this concept of art. We know that there is something valuable that needs to be discovered, but we do not really understand how to take positive steps in that direction. All right. That's enough of the introduction to this series. What do I want to talk about tonight broadly with my next probably 45 minutes. Um, I wanted to start this off by talking about music. This has been something that's been on my mind for a very long time. I always knew that literature was dying. I suspected that movies would, at some sense, die too, and that television would also be replaced. I actually thought that what would happen was that movies would be replaced by television. This is me in the 2000s, by the way. I thought that movies would be replaced by television because television is longer form. You can tell better stories. And then television would ultimately be replaced by some kind of interactive virtual reality video game. That was my Reddit understanding of how media would naturally progress. But that's not what happened. uh, but well, I should say here, I should say, I did believe in the 2000s. I thought that music would be eternal. I thought this would be one human practice that could not be sort of sublimated to other things. Like music was not. Movies were just there because cinemas technologically could only support 2 hour run times. And because we were watching these things in cinemas, they had to be 2 hours because people only wanted to go out for 2 or 3 hour stretches. And you could only see movies outside your house. And the same thing for, the reason why we're watching television is because we can't literally get into the story like virtual reality. Music, though, I thought was eternal. I thought that would always be a thing. And it wasn't. Arguably, or I think very observably at this stage, television and movies have also died. Video games have died. It's amazing. It's amazing. Uh, all media has died. No one makes good video games anymore. No one makes good television anymore. No one makes good movies anymore. It's all been slopified. No one can afford to do it anymore. But I want to start with music because I always thought music was that one thing, that one piece of art that I couldn't really explain. And because I couldn't explain it in a technological way, it had to be eternal. You know, and I guess I'll just kind of go on this in a very linear fashion. So I had kind of an interesting experience with music growing up. I guess we could kind of talk about music historically. Obviously, music was something that was not ever present throughout human history. I think singing has been ever present throughout human history, or at least in most European cultures. I've been told that there are some Bedouin cultures or there are some Asiatic cultures where the idea of carrying tunes and melody is just kind of considered anathema. And this is something that's considered kind of religiously objectionable. I think it has to do something with Islam, which kind of looks down on musical forms as well. But other than those rare exceptions, I think that music in the human heart is something that's very eternal. It is, in its ordinary form, meant to be a communal act of celebration. That is, music in its primordial human conception is supposed to be the instantiation in art of a moment. And because of that, all of our music is designed, as we understand it right now, is designed around, I would say, sort of two or three separate things. I mean, there are the music. There's the music of the temple. There's the music of the collective gathering, and there's the music of the lover. And I probably could think of more, but these are all experiences of great pathos. Music is probably the best expression of human pathos, human emotion that can be captured in a medium easily. I don't think painting quite does it. I don't think fine art quite does it. I think that it has to be music. It has to be something that's carried forward in tune and rhythm. Because the essence of music is rhythm, because the essence of music is that moment, that place, that person singing it. Even when it gets to classical. I had a very strange relationship with music growing up. I think I was very late to it. I'll say that it didn't really make sense to me. I think this was because I'm, very slightly autistic. I don't know what that means. I don't have any diagnosable autism. It's just something. I think every kid in California in the 1990s was diagnosed with autism at some stage. But anyway, I didn't quite understand it. My parents liked classical music. My dad, in particular, was one of these believers that classical music was the only good music. My mother played piano, and we tried to do singing at some stage. I only later learned that they had a whole collection of musical albums from the 1960s when they'd gone, or the 70s when they'd gone through that period. And but it was, music was something that was kind of ethereally in the background. I recognized it from some tunes, from Christmas carols, but not really in a. And my parents listened to classical, and I didn't really understand classical very much. There's like random stuff like Peter and the Wolf, like the typical kids orchestras people listen to, but I didn't really understand it, and it certainly didn't, appeal to me in a direct way. I know a lot of kids that they grow up listening to pop music, and it's much more present for them. Uh, I don't ever, and then like there's kids songs, like the silly songs, like John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt. I don't know if that really counts, but it. And my own son, he listens to, like, we listen to pop music in the car, like, or iPods or whatever, or iPhones these days. So I guess I haven't kind of followed tradition. My wife is obviously a classical music musician, and so my own son has a much more eclectic smattering of different genres. But I remember kind of being very kind of listening to music and going like, okay, so that's something that's going on over there, and I'm not really feeling it. And I went from, as a young child, really feeling like music was something outside of me, to as a young adult feeling like I think music might be the most important expression of art ever. And and I remember kind of this process unfolding, discovering each of the genres in their place, and kind of realizing, oh, so that's what it is. And I'll start first with my mother was a big jazz fan, always listening to NPR jazz stations. I always hated jazz. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand it. The reason why, it's kind of a petty reason why I couldn't stand it, because as a self-centered kid, my wife, my mother, my mother always used to cook, and she always used to have the radio on. The radio was always playing NPR, and NPR meant that she wasn't paying attention to me. She was just zoning out doing cooking, and this was a big. Kids always hate it when their parents are paying attention to something that's not them. That's my son hates it too. Why are you paying attention to the radio? You should be paying attention to me. And what is this weird jazz music? It and I ended up kind of really liking jazz, and I guess later folk music, for the same reason, where I kind of encountered it in ways that I understood the moment it was describing. I always remember there's this old even have the record here. These uh in my grandfather had this old cabin out in the Russian River, and it was just full. It had no amenities, no television, but it was filled with records. And the records were kind of like these old. I have it here. I shouldn't be careful because I'm not going to break this thing, right? These old 1930s records. I you call them vinyls. These things aren't vinyls. These things are made out of something that is a composite material that feels like glass. I don't actually know what material they're in. I have a record player now, and I can play them. There's one song on these records. They go for 3 minutes, literally. And something about these records being played in inside an environment, in the background of an environment where there was no other distractions, made them make more sense. Obviously, I remember this one. I think everyone remembers, like the Chattanooga Choo Choo. That's a old jazz standards, but kind of everything that was played on these records kind of sunk into my mind a little bit and made me realize that jazz is about a moment. It's about kind of this groove of this moment, this casual feeling. Out of all of the genres, jazz kind of hangs in the air. Now, the ones here, this is a foxtrot. These are old kind of big band standards that I play this for my son. And yeah, he watches this cartoon called Cuphead, which is based on like the video game, which is itself based on those old hose arm animations like Betty Boop from the 1930s. And he calls it Cuphead music because of that, because of the cartoon on Netflix, because they play this big bad jazz dude there. Like I don't want to say Cole Porter, but there's a variety of these guys back in the day had the big jazz numbers with the singers. It was African Americans or whatever, and it was Cole Porter obviously was white, but it was a whole scene. It was a whole moment, and it always felt like noise to me until I heard it on record for some strange reason. Heard it on record, no television around. Suddenly, it started making sense. And then I started, I mentioned this before, I heard Vince Guaraldi on Peanuts. And again, like in the context of its time, I had never experienced the 1920s. Peanuts is all about being in the 1920s and growing up in this environment where there's just nothing around, no television. That's one of the things about Peanuts. I don't know if they later incorporated television to make it seem more relatable to modern audiences. But to me, the critical thing about Charlie Brown is he doesn't own a television. This is what it was like for Charles Schultz to grow up in like middle of middle America in the 1920s. Like there's just plains. There's no history. There's just houses and grass and fields and no television, and you're just out there. And what hangs in the air in these Peanuts cartoons is Vince Guaraldi's kind of standards 1950s jazz. And I myself was given a CD of that for Christmas. And I think I wore that out, just playing it over and over and over again on my little CD player in my room. And it was just it's amazing to kind of see how it cooks in the air, jazz. That is the one critical thing about it, I think. I'm going on digressions here. I guess that's why you signed up. You signed up to these podcasts for endless digressions. But the essence, as I kind of came to know it, was that it is rhythmic. It is not so ethereal as to be classical music, and it is local. Jazz is happening now. It is rhythmic. It's carrying forward. It's driving the moment in this motion, this walking, this churning that's going forward. Things are happening, but at the same time, things aren't happening so fast that the moment oppresses itself on you. Things are moving forward and in a walk, in a groove, in a style. And all jazz seems to kind of have this. That there are moments where jazz can kind of drive you towards introspection and where it can kind of energize you, but never so much that it feels like it oppresses you. Never so much that it feels like it forcibly enthralls itself. It is always someone that drives forward a certain groove, but one that kind of lets people be in their place more than anything else. And I think that it can only be experienced in certain places. And the same thing is true with classical music. I didn't really experience classical music until I started seeing it in orchestra halls. And it was weird. Just the most profound thing about any classical music symphony or any performance at all is just the instruments tuning themselves. It's like that moment in classical music, the moment in classical music when the instruments tune themselves right before they don't always have conductors. Like most string quartets don't have conductors. Most soloists don't have conductors. But the moment before the classical music begins, In the moment of tuning, it is in the moment of silence, always followed by like a cough or something like that. It is it is that, and then the journey that begins and then the finishing. Uh, it really requires that, right? Because in classical, whereas jazz is this moment that is progressing into its own groove. It's carrying Jazz is progressing with you as you breathe through a moment you're experiencing in a particular place that is notably free from anything that would impose itself on your attention. Jazz is the music of a mood occupying a place that would otherwise be filled with boredom and silence, but that the mood is too noticeable for silence or from any enthralling moment of oppression to eke out over your senses and kind of impose itself upon you. Classical music, on the other hand, is Promethean. It's Promethean. It takes that moment of silence that comes after the tuning, like God looking out on the universe and saying, "Let there be light," and then the chaos that was the crowd speaking afterwards is shattered by pure order. Classical music is pure order. It's purely ethereal. And again, it's not like all classical music is the same kind of thing. There's Baroque and classical, which is as close as you can get to kind of pure. When people say pure listening music, you always hear that. Oh, classical music before the Romantic era. A teacher said this to me. Classical music before the Romantic era was pure listening music, and I felt like saying, okay, so what is classical music after the Romantic era? Not listening music? Like it's not, like, what else are we doing with classical music other than listening to it? Were people doing something other than listening to music before the classical era? I guess it's pure listening music in the sense that maybe people weren't dancing to it, but people were dancing to classical music in the classical era. So that's not true. So pure listening music. I think what they mean by that is that it's structured in a way that is meant to be just purely a vision of beauty and it's in some sense much more divorced from emotions or directly relatable emotions. It- when you get to the pure classical music of the Baroque era and of the classical period, like Mozart, before you hit Beethoven, it is neither a ballad and a story like folk music, which has like you're just literally being told what to feel by the story, and it's also not the whole 19th century. We're going to impose the emotion on you through the strength of the instruments. The Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. It is the form, and of course, there's obviously hints of emotion. It is sort of the ethereal form of beauty. The God's word, let there be light. The order that totally dominates chaos and creates a vision of ordered beauty before it eventually brings itself to a climax, to an apex point, and then disappears into silence once again. It is kind of like the beatific vision in microcosm. I don't know, that's probably praising it too much. But that period of classical music, it's just so ethereal and it's captured only by that moment. And that's why when I look at something like Fantasia, I think back to Fantasia. This is a movie that I saw as a kid. I didn't make anything of it. And then I saw it as a slightly older kid after having been brought to concerts with my parents. Now, a critical thing about the concerts is that I saw how much my parents valued them. They were atheists or agnostics or whatever. The classical music hall was as close to them entering a temple as I had ever seen them. This was their vision of religious worship, as close as I could see it. And it was that explosion of order into chaos and the belief in ethereal, eternal beauty that permeated the universe and in some sense made it all make sense. And there are stories told within that framework, but it is that vision of eternal order that is sort of the overarching thing of classical music. And it begins with the orchestra. It begins with the instruments tuning up and the chattering of people then being brought to a silence, and then the beginning. And I think that was always the genius of Walt Disney with Fantasia. If Fantasia was just cartoons with classical music in the background, it would have been forgotten because there were tons of old cartoons from the 30s that put classical music in the background of cartoons dancing around. The most important thing in Fantasia is that orchestra in the background. This is a real orchestra. You're listening to real classical music. And the cartoons are just sort of suggestions of things that you might be feeling in the context of this machine that we've created, of divinity. God's machine is classical music. It's the best way I can put it. And everything else is just a suggestion, and it requires that moment of you're looking out into nothingness, chaos has been banished, and you're waiting for the pure song to begin. That is the moment that explains classical music. And I didn't understand it before that, I think. And I don't know if I necessarily have a moment where I understood folk music. It's a little bit of a harder one, right? But I do remember later on in man, I was really old when I got into rock music. It's kind of embarrassing. I think it was like in my sophomore year of high school or whatever. Like most people get into it when they're preteens or whatever. And I was listening to it on this is during the alternative craze, and I remember listening to it on my way carpooling to tennis practice. I was on the tennis team for exactly 1 year before I got cut. And I always had to carpool to the games. And on the way over, we listened to alternative rock stations. And so, I think this is my freshman year. I forget what year it was in high school. So I got introduced to all like, the Smashing Pumpkins, that was obviously my favorite band when I was in high school. And all the alternative bands like Radiohead I learned about a lot later, but like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all that stuff, and even the one hit wonders. As a matter of fact, I think the one hit wonders from that era stuck with me longer emotionally than the actual bands themselves until much later. But I didn't really understand like what rock music. For me, it was just like rock music. I'll say this about rock music. Rock music is like jazz, except unlike jazz, where your emotions kind of are expected to kind of do a lot more work, rock music has its emotions kind of impose themselves on you. You can't ignore rock music the way that jazz can kind of fade into the background a lot of times, and classical music can kind of fade into the background. I mean, if you listen to Chattanooga Choo Choo, that doesn't fade into the background, right? That's a big band number. You can't possibly ignore it, and it's still jazz too. But at the same time, this is not something that is. It's not like an electric guitar coming at you from Van Halen. It's not like the Rolling Stones singing, Brown Sugar or Time Is on My Side. Rock music has this imposing quality to it, and it's what makes it a different genre from jazz. And for me, that's enough, I guess. In a sense, I do admire rock music. I would say that rock music is in many ways the genre of music that I like the most to listen to. That's kind of weird because at this stage of my life, every piece of music feels contextual. Every music feels like it only belongs in a certain place. But if I'm driving in a cars in particular, that's where rock music is particularly welcome. You're driving in a car, and in a modern scenario, this is not like a bus. Like if it was a bus or a train, jazz would feel more appropriate, right? But when you're in a car, you are driving down the road. You're forcing the universe into motion around you. It's like you have the gas pedal and you can gas that car and go through the light just when that chord hits in a rock song. And that is the apex experience of rock and roll. I mean, and there's an experience of the rock concert too. And I guess I'm getting into that a little bit. Um, the uh, the problem with rock for me initially was that I always felt that, again, like classical music, it was something that was outside of me. Like I could get into it. It felt good when I was driving, but I didn't really make the transition from liking rock music a lot to loving it until late high school, early college, when I kind of met up with these older kids, these college students, who were doing this kind of like band project, and I uh, kind of glommed onto their scene for a little bit, and I realized that rock music was about this moment, this kind of, and you know, it was something that I kind of discovered in one genre in particular. And this is an album that kind of means a lot to me. This album here, I have the record. This is My Bloody Valentine's Loveless. This is kind of my transition to understanding rock in a different way. There's nothing on the cover. It's just pink electrical guitar frets or whatever. For me, I was very much fascinated with this particular variety of alternative rock music that you could hear in between bands like Sonic Youth and My Bloody Valentine, and to a certain degree, Smashing Pumpkins. And we called this shoegazer back in the day, but that was the first time when I remember that, going to a concert, local concert, and kind of experiencing this feeling that what the music was doing was it was summoning this certain spirit that was being experienced by people playing it and by people listening to it, a certain zeitgeist. Previous versions of rock and roll were, okay, so this is someone else's zeitgeist. They're experiencing some kind of deep spirituality, and this occurred like in the 1960s, or maybe in Long Beach, California in the early 90s, or maybe in some grunge club in Seattle in the 19 early 1990s when I was still in grade school or whatever. But shoegazers and some of the bands that I had experienced, I never played in one. I was never really, all I played was the violin, right? um, but that was the experience that what we're evoking is kind of this spirit of alienation that's connected nevertheless with this deep feeling of beauty and remembrance of a more innocent time that's being experienced through this moment. I don't know a better way of explaining Sonic Youth or Smashing Pumpkins or My Bloody Valentine or half a dozen other of these bands other than through that sort of mysterious feeling that pervaded both the music. The music invoked a place, and sometimes it even evoked a place that I had never been to, or perhaps a time that I never remember experiencing. But the critical thing was to realize that this was not a hypothetical space. This was a space that literally existed. I could experience sort of an echo of that in the late 90s or early 2000s. And that carried through all of these musical expressions. And we were all trying to experience this at once. This is getting ridiculously abstract. Throughout all of these things, um, I think music expresses two things. It expresses a time and a place. And once more, I think, I realized that I think the last musical genre that really captured this well was the whole vaporwave phenomenon of the 2010s. This was a kind of, and I wish, that, what was it? Midnight, was that the big band? And there were a thousand other remix techno bands, Saint Pepsi or whatever. Well, that was more a vaporwave, and I think Midnight was more like a retro nostalgia 80s. I think vaporwave was the last musical genre where I can remember people experiencing the same feeling that I had in these early shoegazer bands, that you were being transported to a certain place where a spirit was trying to reach out and show you something. I mean, I think that is in rock music's case, it's being imposed on you. In jazz music, it's inviting you on to kind of groove with it. In classical music, it's literally, I feel like it's like this god. this- you're looking into it through the heavens as one would look into a starry night or something like that, or look at the moon or the sun or something like that. Very abstract, but all of them have the same quality. It's the moment in the place pushing forward to greater experiences. And it's something I just don't understand. In modern music, it feels that we've kind of replaced that with noise. That is we're engaged in kind of a collective performance. And I don't want to lay this at the fold of hip hop. One of the things that I remember is radio, and this is a technology that was on its way out by the time I was really listening to music at all. I mean, very few people were listening to the radio. Uh, you know, the satellite radio hadn't quite come into its own at that stage. It was being talked about. Really rich people were doing it, but there's still terrestrial radio stations, and what terrestrial radio stations forced you to do, and this is really why I think radio was at the heart. It's a very bad genre for classical music. Radio, it is a very bad genre for classical music because you're always tuning into the classical music in the middle of it, and that ruins the whole thing, right? Like classical music, you have to be there for the beginning and the end because it is an entire thought. And if you can't get that vision of it, then you're not. I mean, I guess my father always listened to classical music on the radio. I shouldn't say this. I always felt that classical music was horribly translated into the radio, but the radio was perfect, perfect for capturing the holy moment that was rock and jazz. Jazz because it could ambiently fill the area, and it could move with you in the groove that you were moving. And in radio, of course, because radio perfectly represents the imposition of force that is driving, right? And most people experienced radio in their cars, and this was always something that was a magic that is very hard to communicate to younger people. That when the radio went on, you knew that everyone around you, you know, obviously there were multiple radio stations, but when songs ruled the waves on the radio, they literally ruled the airwaves. They were everywhere. You were inside of them. You were being carried forward by the moment. And that moment was either laid back and jazzy or, exploded forth like a rock ballad. And then sometime around the 2000s, rock died. Again, something that I'm still trying to piece together. To go back to the Smashing Pumpkins. This is for those who aren't aware. This is Billy Corgan. He was the Smashing Pumpkins frontman. Somebody who just again, like I had this. They were my favorite band in high school, and there's always this deep insecurity when you revisit things that you were obsessed with at a younger age, because you think to yourself, man, I was really too much into them in high school. Like I felt that they had like this ethereal meaning to their music, and now I go back to it and it's not so much. I re-listened to some of again, it is very much a product of its time. It is very much a product of the 1990s. And in the Smashing Pumpkins case, it is the product of the 1990s with styles that Corgan took from the 70s and 80s. Particularly people like Cheap Trick and Black Sabbath, and even a lot of the stuff like Sonic Youth and My Bloody Valentine, the earlier shoegazer stuff. But I think that he really captured, he did what I felt he did what no one else did, which was he had a vision of something that was spiritual that I could not explain. And I still can't quite explain it. And indelibly, his music was kind of, he had 5 albums on the initial run of the Smashing Pumpkins that saw mainstream publication. And in each one of them, I felt like there was some kind of spirit that was being grasped at. And I felt that was it was true for Radiohead in a different way, right? Radiohead was sort of, in my mind, the ultimate counterpoint to Smashing Pumpkins, because Smashing Pumpkins was saying there was a spirit here. It was like Smashing Pumpkins walked into a room and said, there was a spirit here. There was a ghost in this room and it died. And now we're remembering this thing that was. And we're kind of doing a seance and trying to bring back this spirit of optimism and the future that once was that is now dead, right? That is how all of the Pumpkins music felt. Radiohead, and I think Morgoth agrees with me, Radiohead was looking forward and going, this is the bleakness of the empty room and the poetry of the empty room. It was existentialist. It was alienating. It was gripping emotionally. And I think both Morgoth and I had the same opinion of it, is that when we first heard Radiohead, we thought, especially two albums, OK Computer and Kid A, the emotion was, this is the future. But what Radiohead was presenting, and then stealing this from Morgoth, this was an end. Whereas the Pumpkins felt kind of like the funeral of rock and roll to a certain extent. And there were also very good bands that came afterwards. I'm not saying there weren't. I might mention a few of them. Radiohead was pointing to the world that came after culture itself died. And it was capturing a spirit, but it was the spirit of death itself almost. Their most notable songs, I'll off the top of my head, Street Spirit, the feeling of emptiness, the feeling that the devil is behind you and is in a sense bring the end to everything that's going that once was. Street Spirit, Fade Out, how to disappear completely. Does that even need an explanation? Letdown is just the alienation of being on a modern transit line. All of these things are these deep absences in Radiohead's music. And, the ghost of a presence was always Corgan's strong suit. And I'm this is going to totally alienate all non-90s kids here. But what was interesting is that I haven't listened to Corgan in the longest time. And I saw him on Joe Rogan. And he was talking about the death of rock and roll, right? And he was of the opinion that this was really interesting to me, because I noticed the same thing. Around about 98, rock went from being a genre that was pushing forward at the height of art. This was the way to experience something and to express it to people, was through rock and roll. That was what rock and roll was for. And then almost overnight, from 98 to 99, it became period. It became, and again, there were still great bands. When I think about my experiences until about 2014, an amazing little indie scene sprung up that with people like Elliott Smith and Neutral Milk Hotel, and I think he might have even been from the 90s, but he got popular in the 2000s. And the Decemberists, that was one of my favorites too. And even people like Tool, which I wasn't, I felt kind of like they were like the metal version of King Crimson. I was always more of a King Crimson fan. But even people like the White Stripes, but the problem with these people, these bands, which were just as good as they were in the 90s to a certain extent, spiritually and artistically, they were just as good. The zeitgeist wasn't there. The culture was not moving with these bands. The culture was moving in this direction, and that these indie bands from the 2000s were moving in an entirely different direction, right? And what eventually happened is that the indie movement ran out of road. It could no longer convince people that it was doing anything than describing a spirit that once was, until you get to Vaporwave, where they just drop the pretense. They drop the pretense and say, well, imagine it was the 80s. And imagine we were in the 80s, and then we could make you have this experience that is like the 80s. And what was so crazy about Vaporwave was that even though, like myself, even though all of the younger millennials had never even lived through the 80s, they still remembered. They could feel the spirit of the 80s in the music trying to break out. Just like Billy Corgan could sing a song about what it was like to be a youth in 1979. And I could feel the old Americana and the magic of the moment that it created then. And I could feel how it must have been to be in that the last gasp of that idyllic American suburbs before the cynicism of the Cultural Revolution took over and middle America began dying in earnest. I could feel that even though I never had experienced it, and I could catch the echoes of it in the live performances and in the records of that time. But Corgan, in this interview with Rogan, he wasn't talking to Rogan. I think it was Rogan. He did a variety of interviews where he talked about this. He seemed to believe that this was a deliberate decision, that rock had become, in essence, something that I think Corgan was, the way he talks about it, it sounds like it's like a conspiracy to control people. And I don't think Billy Corgan actually believes that. I think that he believes that it was something that was hard to market easily. And what marketed easily was hip hop. And it's not like there's no virtue to hip hop, right? And maybe I'll talk about that a little bit too. It was I'll talk about that a little bit later. But hip hop was easier to standardize. It was easier to contain. It was easier to push to a broad audience. If rock had continued, it would only, if the spirit of rock had continued in the mode it was in the 90s, there would be far more bands, but there would never be another hit band like the Beatles. It was entering into a mode. Maybe rock died because it didn't make sense in an information age. It was the genre of the car radio, and in the internet age that didn't quite translate as well. So there is possible that this was a technological difference, but I also believe that if rock were to have continued, it would have shattered. There would have been a lot of bands that were as good as the Smashing Pumpkins, but they would be regional. There would be no ability to take the experiences and put it on to a global platform. And that's what rap and hip hop and rap are kind of the same thing, but hip hop and rap and R&B and bubblegum pop, they were all something you could sell to the entire world. Bad Bunny, who the fuck cares what he says? It's the same techno beat, it's the same reggae beat. It doesn't matter if it's in Spanish, right? It's just the music. It's the thing that's happening. And I don't want to like completely put down pop, but I think Billy Corgan has a point here, is that there was something that was very Faustian about rock music. It demanded a certain level of spirituality and therefore demanded a certain particularity of experience to really get. Whereas pop, for all its other merits, is a very generalizable kind of music. And so is hip hop in a way, although there is a way that it is very particular. And I think that like the death of rock, or the periodification of rock, right? You can still have a rock band that is really good, but it is like having a bluegrass band that is really good. Bluegrass bands call back to a moment in the early 20th century, and rock bands are a callback to a certain moment in the late 20th century. And sure, you can ride that spirit and you can use it, but it is very much a period form of music. This is something that I cover a little bit. I wrote, I'm highly cribbing from an article I wrote in on my Substack. Everyone go check it out there. It is, of course, very, very long because I was struggling with a lot of different feelings about this. And I entered into that's me, by the way. In case you didn't, it's like, how much weight have I gained since I was 22? That's what I look like at age 22. And, yes, I am trying to look like Bob Dylan in that photo because I'm literally, jamming with a band that we had a folk band back in the day, right? Very unsuccessful. We didn't cut any records, so I'm glad that's not an album cover or anything like that. But people were trying to find this moment. I think millennials in particular were trying to find a genre of music that was all our own in the 2000s. And we completely failed at this task. And we completely failed at this task. In my thesis in this Resonance of Lost Americana was that millennials were being asked to inhabit a they were being asked by their spiritual inclinations to inhabit a mode of life that was more humble. And we didn't have the humility to develop a real folk life, and we didn't have the pure courage to develop like a Faustian life where we took over the entire country, we made it our own, like the boomers. And so what we ended up doing is we had musical forms that were neither hot nor cold. We couldn't decide whether we were ascendant or whether we were the wintertime generation. I think we were the wintertime generation. And because of that, we sort of shrunk from the spirit that the age was asking us to embrace. At its heart, music is an anthem. Again, music is, of all art forms, it is the most connected to place and it is the most connected to time. And the spirit that it embodies is the spirit of place and time that can never be recaptured again. When you have music, it is your anthem. And this is the one thing I'll say about rap music that is highly flattering. One problem, and again, this is nothing that Zoomers don't really seem to understand that millennials did. We were the last generation to see this. To Zoomers, music is something that is going on in the background. Music is something that the algorithm picks for them. For millennials and Xers and boomers, at least the millennials that came before the social media revolution, music was something that you chose. It was yours. You would go through used record shops. That's where I found this, My Bloody Valentine record. That's, and it became like my thing. It was an anthem. It's intimately connected to your identity as a person, and to what the moment is calling you to do. And across the millennial generation, we stopped listening to music in the same way we did because we no longer believed that the anthem represented something that was true. And that this is one thing about rap music is unapologetically an anthem. And the problem with rap music is what made rap music so cringe. And I have admired a lot of rap artists. I actually did kind of like Kanye West. I think that the early artists like Biggie Smalls, like very talented guy, right? I can't say that this has always been at the top of my playlist. It's kind of been one of the lesser ones, but it was the problem always with rap is it is a core part of what music is. First of all, it's a lot more like poetry than it is like music in the way European people have conceptualized it. But that's more of the minor problem. The big problem with rap is that it is obviously somebody else's anthem. The way that rap is supposed to be experienced is it's supposed to be the projection. I mean, it's a iteration of the American music known as blues, or a very primitive form of blues. And blues. Obviously, blues is the quintessential musical form. It is the musical form that informs most genres of jazz, although there are some, there's some very old genres of jazz that are kind of parallel to that. It obviously is the principal influence on rock and roll and on most later 20th century musical styles. It is the quintessential musical style, but in its earlier iteration, blues is supposed to be a confessional anthem of one particular blues artist's. one particular blues artist. Like, that's I got the blues. That's the thing, right? The old African American singing on his front porch about the sorry state of his life, what he has looking forward. It's an honest confession of his life. That's what rap is supposed to be. But two problems with rap is that it is in that sense also a little bit fake, right? To the African American community, it presents this sort of triumphalist anthem about how they're dominating the entire world at the very moment in history where it felt like the African American community that was being described was most in recession. And to the white America that it was fed to in the 90s and slowly began to eclipse rock and roll music, it was very obviously something that did not fit into their own lives. Conceivably, the kind of thing that rock music was expressing, the desire for freedom, the desire to break out of constraint, the kind of motion, the dynamism that embodied a feeling that was very organic. Obviously, I don't think anyone had the experience of the Ramones or the Sex Pistols in 1990s America or 1980s America. And these are people who are, in a certain scene that we have no connection to. But the feeling that they expressed was very much amped up and drugged up version of a feeling that was experienced by many people, many other white people. Even the thing with Led Zeppelin. I mean, I always joke about Led Zeppelin that they have two themes. One of them is Lord of the Rings, and the other one is sex. And this is a band that I absolutely love. I cannot get enough of Led Zeppelin, and it is something about me knows deep in my soul that it is kind of stupid. That Led Zeppelin. What is Led Zeppelin? It's a bunch of English guys that listened to a bunch of 1930s and 40s and 50s jazz musicians. And they just are, sorry, not jazz, blues musicians, right? I don't think that Led Zeppelin comes from Lead Belly, but that was always the rumor, right? Because their rock music is highly blues influenced. And then they made it really, really hard and really, really aggressive with loud guitars. And in the process, spawned a whole new musical genre. In a sense, well, obviously it's still rock and roll. That's what rock and roll is, but they made it more so, right? But it is kind of silly. It's like English guys playing African American blues, and the main themes are how horny I am, how big my member is, and then themes from J.R.R. Tolkien, who would have been completely alienated by the other three themes on display in most Led Zeppelin songs. But it's brilliant because it's brilliant in a sense because that kind of feeling is present in adolescent men. It's like those three contradictory feelings. It's just the perfect emotion, like extreme horniness, like this animalistic horniness, and at the same time, this sort of feeling of blues, of kind of slight depression, like of urgency that you get from kind of like the blues riffs that are incorporated by Led Zeppelin. And then also, like from Tolkien, this deep feeling of mysticism that lies behind everything and the desire for adventure. And when you listen to Stairway to Heaven, it feels like you're listening to like a medieval minstrel. And there's multiple Led Zeppelin songs like that. Like this medieval minstrel, this medieval troubadour is talking about the adventure that lies for you, or that somebody is uncovering in a distant land, and that is there for you to get. And it's not simply adventure. It's also communion with a spirit that you can't quite explain. She's building a stairway to heaven. What does that mean? What does that mean? Not all that glitters is gold. It's a riddle. It's the riddle. There's a spirit in that riddle of adventure that's waiting for you right across the horizon. That's a very native emotion to young. I'm not trying to racialize this. This is a native emotion to most young men. But in particular, it's a very native emotion to men who come from a Faustian culture, aka white men. Even if they haven't had experiences of that variety themselves, that is what's welling up from inside of them. rap music is admirable. It is aggressive. It is heroic. It is 100% false triumphalism, which is hard not to become aware of when you kind of sing along with it. And B, it is also transparently not the experience that young middle class white men have. Uh, I don't know how to put it, but it's like, I mean, you're basically saying it feels like this, and I apologize to people in the audience who like rap, right? Uh, Young men like rap because it's masculine and it's proud and it's out there and it's vital and it's all of those things, and it is great because of those things. It's also not theirs. It's also transparently somebody else's. Even wiggers make fun of other wiggers because it's ridiculous to see a young white guy talking about this stuff with the ghetto. It does not map onto genuine emotions they're having. It is a superposition, and the most native equivalent that I can think of this thing are the boomer patriots from Fox News who can't feel proud about being a white American man, so they project all of their patriotism onto Israel. And so they become the world's, because they can't have an ethno-nationalism of their own, because they can't have a Christian state of their own, because they can't do Christian nationalism, they do Jewish nationalism because that's the acceptable form of nationalism. Well, rap music is the acceptable masculine music in the modern era, and it's the masculine music that moves with the zeitgeist, and so that just becomes the thing. And so I feel it's fundamentally mismatched. All right, I'm coming up on the end of the lecture. Um, Here's where I kind of want to begin the conversation with music. I wonder how we're going to recapture this. I do not think, and I'll say this before, I assume that music was eternal in the sense that I thought that popular music was eternal and would not be displaced by any new media form. Um, and I do believe that there are some cultures that are amusical cultures, but I do not think that any human existence that is recognized as civilized and vital cannot have music as a vital part of its core. I think that when it comes to Islamic civilizations, when you see them in their amusical state, you're witnessing a degraded culture. And I think that something fundamentally about us collectively, like large scale, large groups of humans, should be animated by a common spirit. And the only way to express that spirit is music that is baked into our being. If we leave music by the wayside, we leave a fundamental part of our humanity by the wayside. Either that or, we've degraded to a level of pre-technology and pre-civilization. Civilized man cannot live without music. It is essential for everything about us to have music and for music to be intimately connected to our identities. But how to revive it? Contra Billy Corgan, I don't think that you can just revive rock music. I don't know. Maybe you can. I'm willing to try it, but I think something about it is unsuited for this age. We need to start more basic. Music again is about a place. Right now, the problem is it's hard to locate a place for music. The internet cannot be where music lives. I'm convinced of that. An internet music cannot be the white noise Skinner box that fills the space in the background while you plug away at work or while you mindlessly browse or game. That's not what music is, right? Because then you have music doing what art shouldn't be doing, which is competing to be the world's best Skinner box. That's not what art is supposed to be. Music has to exist in a holy moment. And there was a difference between driving in your car was a holy moment. Sitting at your office job, clicking spreadsheets or talking with AI or doing whatever. That's not a holy moment. That is gray time. And music has to be kept away from gray time. And it can only exist in time that is focused to a point and focused to a spirit. That could be a experience of listening to music live. That could be deliberately putting a record on the record player. Hopefully one that doesn't break into 1,000 pieces if you drop it. Be careful of those old ones. For my money, it's got to start being live. And, this is another thing I brought here. One thing that I really want people to rediscover, sacred music. This is a very interesting cultural artifact I have here from my old days after I kind of quit the whole folk music scene or trying to start a band. I try to, dabble in folk music, like playing it in jam sessions or whatever. And I also did this singing music called Sacred Harp. Sacred Harp is a form of Protestant sacred music. This was supposed to be early on in this country's history. This was supposed to be the way that all ordinary people, all ordinary good church Protestants could get together and sing the same songs. It's designed with this thing called shape notes so that any person could pick this up and immediately lock into 3-part vocal harmony around any of the hymns that are contained in the book. And the idea was that this is a Rosetta Stone for sacred music liturgy. Now, I'm terrible at this. When I go to Mass, the last thing I want to do is sing, usually because I'm trying to, distract my son, keep him from futzing around, right? But even before that, I felt like I just can't get into this. If you want some place to try to recreate music for yourself, recreate the musical discipline, it has to start with training ourselves as Christian. Well, maybe people who are watching it aren't Christian. But I can't believe that you are a Faustian individual and don't understand the need for sacred music. And sacred music is, by its very nature, collective, which means that there has to be a set of songs that everybody knows. It's the duty of adults to know those songs and to be able to cultivate their playing. Now, maybe that would also, if you are so inclined, move from sacred music to folk music, which is a genre that I've always loved. I don't know how it fits into our life. It does, in some sense. I think folk music will become apparent to us after we rediscover sacred music. I think it's the next logical step. We don't have enough discipline to really wield music in this way. But I think folk music will kind of be something that adds on to that afterwards. On top of that, we have to come up with more deliberate ways of listening to music. Again, the solution to this project is not the internet and cannot be on the internet. You have to look at your music collection and be proud of it. You have to lift up every album you have, and it's better to have physical copies of albums, because otherwise, what are you proud about? Being proud. Back in the 2000s, people thought they would be proud of their collection of MP3s. That turned out not to be the case. I think very few people are proud of their voluminous collection of MP3s. I think for a while, Apple tried to encourage that, but eventually the rise of streaming services made that a non-reality because everyone had the same standardized music library as everyone else in the world. Take pride in your musical collection and organize your listening of music around deliberate decisions of humans. Once the algorithm is picking the song for you, then it's no longer really the same thing. It's just you and the computer is feeding you an experience. In order for there to be a deliberate listening experience, some human has to take an album off of the shelf and say, this album is the correct album for this particular moment and this particular place. We have been talking a lot in the OGC and in various other community building organizations about various projects we would like to undertake. And people always talk a lot about art. I said this for the longest time. I think that there's going to be a hunger for the revival of web radio. And by that, I mean the very thing that people always used to complain about on the radio. Oh, we hate disc jockeys. We hate disc jockeys. We hate disc jockeys. Probably the Zimmers listening don't even know what a disc jockey is, but the disc jockey was the guy that would tell you what you had just listened to and then would cue up the next song. And he would usually do it in a really silly voice. But he was the person who decided what would be played. It was a deliberate decision. People used to complain about this all the time. But that was the most essential thing because the disc jockey would be the person who ruled the airwaves. He curated what you were listening to. He gave it context. In the age of AI music, when a song comes on, I want to know that that song isn't algorithmically generated. Listening to an algorithmically generated song defeats the entire purpose of the music itself. Because it's supposed to be a communication of individuals. Someone's saying I struck them as the guy who didn't like music. I guess maybe when I was 8, I certainly, my whole life revolved around music when I was in my 20s, or in my late teens. But it's that highlighting of the song as being the central element of sacredness that needs to be rediscovered. And that is the heart of the restoration of this art form. I think this offers up a lot of opportunities. I think that people have been talking about doing we do live events in our community building organizations. I don't know why we can't make music a part of that. Hire a band for a gig. It would really enhance the organizations, the event, and I think it would create a dimension of artistry to the operations that we're doing. And just realizing that if you're in a collective that you believe in, whether it's your country, a union, people used to have union songs, whether it's a sense of ethnicity that you have, there are folk songs that characterize your ethnicity, whether it's a political organization, there were political anthems. And certainly if it is a spiritual inclination, every collective that you're a part of should have some musical form associated with it. If it is operating collectively, properly. Now, you may not like the musical form. I hate liturgical music. I think that my church's music sucks, right? But it's important that it does exist. And again, it's your responsibility as a member of the group to make sure that the music there is the most appropriate to the mission. But all aspirations, all collectives of people should strive in their permanence to have an associated musical form. There's a reason why we sing the national anthem before sports games. There's a reason why these pieces of patriotic music exist. The music at the 4th of July is more important than the fireworks because it captures that feeling of collectivity in a moment and in a place. And all collective loyalties are in their ordinary experience territorialized and temporal. They are a series of moments and places. And that's what music captures. And that's what has to be recaptured for human community to really exist in a way that can generate art. I think that should finish up the first lecture in the series. I will talk to you guys next week, although we will do super chats. So, again, guys, this is not the Ordinary Fiddler's Green podcast. This is a different Lenten series. We're doing one every week, and it is music, books, um, theater and movies, and then entertainment and leisure, or entertainment and leisure collectively. And so we'll do one next Wednesday. And in the meantime, let's just go on to the super chats here. Entropy should be up. Oh, wow. Okay. Thanks, guys. Well, you really gave me something tonight. I have no idea how I'm hosting this. I think what I will do is that I will take down this video and then put up a recorded version that has only half of the full audio recording, and then have the full audio recording on the Redwood Society's website to drive more traffic to that. The Redwood Society's blog is, basically a community building organization in California that I'm spearheading with a bunch of other guys here in Northern California. Sorry, guys in LA. You're not going to be able to drive to any of our events unless you're very, very patient. Although, given that you're from LA, you probably drive 8 hours of traffic anyway. Although I think there might be a different chapter for the Southern California guys. But I want to create a web presence that is focused on art and community building more than anything else. So I will be working on that, and I want to drive traffic there. So I might host it that way. But for the time being, the live stream VOD will be on the usual places until I re-upload a different version of it. So thank you, guys. Okay, let's do the super chats here. Anonymous poster 12 for $25. Hi, Dave, longtime viewer. The Epstein situation is disturbing, not because of all he did, but because of how many people knew and did nothing. I grew up near Palm Beach and recently learned my father not only knew, but was paid to provide security for Epstein after his first conviction. I am sick to my stomach. Okay, but let's be charitable to your father here, right? I mean, God, I'm really gonna dox myself here, or my family. These people are all passed away. Look, anonymous poster. We really have to understand how power and evil works. My grandparents on my father's side grew up in Eastern Europe and fought on the wrong side of World War II. And I can assure you that even though they worked security for the mid-century Germans in the form of being part of the military, they had no knowledge of the nefarious things that people in the upper echelons of the Nazi Party were doing or implementing. This is not how things work. The 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 elites that Epstein represents are absolutely evil. And I guess the emails are a revelation of sorts in that it's good to know just how horrible, shitty these people are, and how they regard the rest of us as literal cattle and literally racially inferior to them in their interpersonal communications. They refer to people who are not of their ethnic persuasion as being just less. Which, I mean, let's be honest, we already kind of knew that, right? We already knew that. That's obvious that Benjamin Netanyahu believes that the people who aren't part of his group are fundamentally less than he is. And so this is a common belief, not just for Epstein and Netanyahu, but for all of our ruling class. They all believe this. And even the ruling class that aren't of Benjamin Netanyahu's ethnic persuasion, they all look down on us like peasants. Some of them, like Nathan Koffness, even call us peasants, which is kind of strange. But Look, guys, the people who are part of these organizations, they have no idea what's going on. They knew and didn't. I mean, what did they know? They knew that Epstein is a creepy guy who did creepy things in his private jet and island, and then he's well connected, and there's a lot of rumors, but that's pretty much it. Uh, when you're in business, you deal with a lot of people who are unsavory characters, but who are you're forced to kind of deal with because the economic circumstances require it. And so in our business operations, adults have to develop a certain moral callousness. Now maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe we need to guard our souls against it. It's like Michael Corleone, sending his friend out to get shot. It's nothing personal. It's just business. It's just business. Because in business, you're somehow operating separately from your moral agency. And I guess it's like war, right? It's like war. Like you go to war in Eastern Europe in the 1940s, you're either fighting for Team Stalin or you're fighting for Team Hitler. And I'm not so sure that you're doing anything super moral, regardless of which mass democidal army you're fighting for. But I know it's not your fault. You're doing the best that you can. And you might even be doing something heroic. So we have to be aware of these circumstances. We young people in particular approach history like they approach it like it's just, how sports are. You know how sport, like there's a sport you haven't played. Autistic people are really, there's a joke online. Why don't you score more points? Why don't you score more points in the sports ball? Whenever you watch professional sports, it just looks easy. It looks easy, right? Because you're not there. You're not there. Whenever you get a test back and it's all marked up and you got it all wrong. Like your friend bombed the test, and you look back on it. And how didn't you know the answer to this question? Well, it's because you're looking at the test and it's already done. When you're face down with an actual sporting event and the ball's coming at your head at 100 miles per hour, or you have to dive for a slam in tennis, it's a lot harder. There's nothing harder than the test that's right in front of you. So I don't know. Look, let's cut our parents and our elders a little bit of slack when it comes to dealing with these regrettable situations. But let's not forget that our leaders are a bunch of ghouls, and that's the best word for them, ghouls. These people are absolutely ghouls. Chai squared for $25. I've been listening to the local classical music station. Today is Vivaldi's birthday. Oh, the Red Priest. It's very NPR, but I enjoy having a well-curated list of good music. I'm not well educated in classical music, so I constantly hear new pieces that I really like. I wish I could have something like that without the gay crap. It's like that Stone Toss comic. But without state mandated homosexuality, who would pave the roads? The libertarians like, that always gets us. Without state mandated homosexuality, who would pave the roads? Well, without state mandated homosexual disc jockeys, who would pay the classical music? I don't know. All I can say is there is such opportunity for I don't know, maybe our community isn't big enough, but if we had a curated radio station that was run like college radio by our guys, I would tune into that. I don't know how many other, brain fried Zoomers with zero attention span would tune into that. I do know that it would be healthy to listen to that instead of some kind of, AI slop, auto generated Skinner box. Certainly better than doom scrolling. But why not have curated audio? I feel that's essential. I don't want, it's not as good when you don't trust the person morally on other things. You also don't want to have them curate your music either. I don't know. Charles Mackey for $25 USA. Good evening. I hope you and yours are well. Well, I have allergies, so that's why I'm sniffing tonight. Your recent article, The Resonance of Lost Americana, was excellent. Well, yes, the link is in the description, guys, if you want to read that one. That is the article. So each one of these entries on this series are based on one or more articles that I wrote on Substack, and they will be linked in the description. It should be in the description of the low bar right now if Restream is working. But thank you very much, Charles Mackey. I really appreciate when people read my articles because they're the things that take up the most amount of my time. Toff221 for $15 USA. I'm currently reading 2 volumes on the history of American partner dancing, starting from the early 17th century. Partner dancing. Were there partner dances in the 17th century? Oh my God, I have to have that book. In every chapter, there's a section called Where They Danced. How much do you believe the American cultural development has been affected by our shifting rural and urban landscapes? So, the reason why I am raising an eyebrow at 17th century partner dances is that in the 17th century, partner dancing was considered immoral. For instance, waltzes, although they were very popular among peasants and the lower classes, didn't appear among upper classes until the very late 18th century or the early 19th century, which is why there are no Mozart waltzes. You don't get the classical music waltzes until you get to the Romantic era, pretty much. So I'm interested to see that where there. I thought that that those would have all been considered. Maybe they were talking about like folk music or whatever, because people thought that waltzing, like you're in each other's arms and you're not married. How could this be? But that's really interesting. The question is, how much do you believe the American cultural development has been affected by our shifting rural and urban landscapes? Well, entirely. Like nobody goes to clubs anymore. Dance clubs effectively ended when they all became like hip hop dominated. Because I'm sorry, I think dancing to hip hop is stupid, and dancing to techno music or house is only a little bit better. Somehow very not American. Not that anyone really danced to rock music. It wasn't a very good genre for that. I guess people like mosh pitted or whatever. I mean, I was in more than a few mosh pits in my time, I guess. Or it's not like I was going to them all the time, but whatever. I mean, obviously, the big problem with music these days is that urban decay has really eaten the center out of cultural life in the cities. It's there's very few, many fewer people who are kind of casual listeners to music. Everyone in urban areas always seems like they're trying to do their own art project and less like they're trying to live their lives and experience good art itself. Obviously, the rural landscape is totally destroyed. Country music, as we know it today, was a genre produced specifically for people who had grown up in rural environments and had moved to the cities. That was the market demand that people like the Carter family, and I hate to disillusion people, but the Carter family, while kind of authentic hillbillies to a certain degree, were also very much business people. And they saw that there was a demand for ruralites who had moved to cities to get music that sounded rural in a recorded form to them. And that's what made them, and things like the Grand Ole Opry, like this runaway success that it was, and country music, this pillar of American culture. I don't think that really exists anymore. Country music is largely for this older boomer class of red Americans. I'm not aware of like a thriving young. I mean, I guess there's like this really weird phenomenon in Blue America where you've got these ex-pop stars like Beyonce. And I guess like Taylor Swift originally was country in a certain regard, where they're like adopting country stylings. But I don't know. That's not real country, or that's not real folk music. That's a marketing campaign for pop, and that there's a fundamental difference. folk music is rarely authentically from poor people. I mean, Dolly Parton was famously poor, grew up as like a sharecropper's daughter. But for the most part, most country music, there it's kind of written by people who are well off or middle class, who are like Bob Dylan. They're kind of like aping the affectations of the rural class. But they're at least trying to present a vision that isn't just a marketing campaign, which is what country music is for someone like Beyonce. Thank you very much, Toph221. I am losing my voice extra early because of these allergies. That's the thing. After living in the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast for such a long time, I forgot how many allergies there are in California. Fidel Cash Flow for $10. Well, thank you for contributing to my cash flow, Fidel. Would you rather be locked in a room with Will Martin or Chandra Hardy? I have no idea who Chandra Hardy is. I assume he's a troll. Will Martin is this. he is this. He is this infamous Substack troll. I don't know what the guy does, but he appears in every one of my article commenting. We're all gonna die. There's gonna be no re-enchantment. This is just LARP. And then he accuses me of being Jewish or a communist or gay. I guess like everyone says the California accent sounds that way, or my lisp. I whatever. Man, I would kind of want to meet Will Martin. I want to see the face behind the guy who can comment on 100 Substack art. And like every Substacker knows Will Martin. Like he appears in everyone's comment section on the right, and they all, oh hey Will, how's it going? I hope you're not talking about some other Will Martin here. But let's I'm gonna see if I Google this and see if it's not. Oh, he's a New Zealand. Okay, are you talking about Will Martin, the New Zealand classical crossover singer? That can't possibly be it. I don't listen to any classical crossover singers like Charlotte Church or whatever. I don't think you're talking about that. Well, who's Chandra Hardy? Okay, so that's just some blogger. Okay, I assume you're talking about the Will Martin from Substack, the troll, the troll, not the singer. Okay, I hope I answered that. Asteroidal Assassin for $5. Dave, can you tell my friend Lunar Waves to add me back on Steam? He watches these streams, Lemo. Okay, well, Lunar Waves, please add Asteroidal Assassin back, and don't block him. I know he's a very good guy. And plus, I'm pretty sure he's Persian, and we need to be helping out our Persian listeners financially so they don't come to Western Europe. And also, please pray for them so they can overcome this horrific bombing that my country is inexplicably engaging in for no benefit to its own people. But thank you very much, Asteroidal Assassin. Nerve AMV Maker for $15 USA. When Beethoven premiered his revolutionary Third Symphony, the Viennese public disliked it and called it not real music. That would be the Eroica Symphony, the Heroic Symphony. Initially, I think dedicated to Napoleon, but then I think Beethoven soured on Napoleon. I believe we are in cultural decline, but how does one distinguish genuine critique of a cultural form from the rantings of cranks and snobs incapable of understanding anything new or exciting? It's just passage of time. Like, okay, sure. When Beethoven premiered the Third Symphony, it was met with boos. 20 years later, he was recognized as one of the greatest artists of all time, right? And you had classical musicians asking as their dying wish to be buried next to him. He's buried in Vienna. I believe I saw his grave at the big cemetery there. Um, that was so you know, most people who are not recognized in their time are recognized immediately afterwards. Now there are some exceptions, like Bach was forgotten for about 80 years after his death. He kind of got dismissed as a minor artist, and then he came back in a big way in the 19th century. So that happens, but I mean, people don't remember how long it's been since the 90s. It's been 30 years since the 90s at this stage. I think we have a pretty good perspective on what these musical forms ultimately meant and where the decline actually was. It's pretty uncontroversial that there was a huge decline in quality from the 90s to the 2000s, at least in popular music. And then it never quite revived. Of course, there were indie bands that were good, but they were small. They were smaller acts, and they never got the kind of prominence in the culture that you saw from artists before that. So, Nerve and B Maker, you know, first of all, you have to engage with the art honestly, and I think that a little bit of time will almost always settle these disagreements. You can easily see the decline in filmmaking. Like, it's been 10 years since we've had a genuinely good movie in Hollywood, like, or a good year in movies in Hollywood. And if you compare the output of 2010 or 2012 to the output of movies in 2007, it's night and day. And that's 3 years difference. You know, in 2007, you have There Will Be Blood. You have No Country for Old Men. You have a thousand other entries. It was an amazing year for movies. 4 years later, nothing. And then it only gets worse from there. So even waiting 5 years will give you the perspective. Also, if something offends people, then there's a possibility that they're not ready for it yet. If they greet it with indifference, it's probably just bad. Like, Bad Bunny doesn't offend me. I just kind of roll my eyes at it because it's repetitive slop. It's schlock, for lack of a better word. There's nothing interesting there. It's not even offensive. It's not like gangster rap where, like, it is offending people. Like, Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls, they basically disgusted people with their lyrics and morally offended them. Now, I mean, I think those are two good artists. I think that they themselves represented a musical decline from past forms. Rap music is kind of a degraded musical form, not just a different one. But they were talented artists, and Bad Bunny is not. Doubting Thomas for $15 USA. Is there any way from first principles to come to a conclusion that the creating entity of the universe has personhood without invoking moral value or a perception of will in its creation? As someone predisposed to naturalism, a metaphysical person appears as humans anthropomorphizing the world. Wow, we're saving the hard questions for last. That is one of the hardest questions I've gotten. I mean, look, this is an answerable question. I could show you results that we have in physics that appear crazy. For instance, mathematics appears through mathematics and physics. It appears that the logic that we have in our head directly corresponds with some fundamental nature about the universe. For instance, our preference for symmetry, which we biologically evolved, is correlated with how the universe actually works. Our preference for integers based on our fingers correlates to how the nature of quantums work at a basic level where we can never see them. And you could go over many examples of this. Unfortunately, Doubting Thomas, every one of those correlations between how the universe actually works and how the human mind works could be attributed to projection. If, for instance, I looked out into the sky and literally saw a face of God repeating the words of Genesis down to me, that could be attributed to my own internal brain projecting that onto the universe. So there's no amount of skepticism that can defeat this question. So go into that with that being your default assumption. No matter what we do, human beings' brains are going to imprint that nature onto the universe. Now, there are things that seem damn unlikely in that process. There's certain qualities of repeatability and order in the universe that you would not think would be present in a purely chaotic system without intention. And that's an emotional appeal in a sense, but it's also a strange observation. This is not the universe that would emerge from pure chaos. And then the question is, okay, well, what even is order outside of chaos? And I don't know. You start asking these philosophical questions and you start answering them in the best way you can as a human. You start developing qualities to the ultimate origin of the universe that start looking very human-like. They look more like a human than anything else that we have an analogy for in our universe. And because of that, many thinkers have come to the idea that God has personal qualities. But none of those arguments cannot be dismissed by appeals to the anthropic principle that we are just projecting all of this because we are human brains perceiving the universe and therefore perceive a human brain. I hope that helps. Rotten Meat for $3 USA. Your description of rock versus hip hop directly maps to harder to control. Directly maps to harder to control. Well, yeah, I mean, I think rock and roll is harder to control than hip hop. Hip hop is pacifying masculinity, and rock and roll is Promethean masculinity. And it's easier to control passive masculinity or random masculinity or animalistic masculinity than it is to control militaristic masculinity. Nerve A&V Maker for $10 USA. Interesting note on Disney and Fantasia. We view him as a child entertainer today, but his synchronization of music to moving drawings captivated all the great Russian composers, such as Stravinsky, Shostakovich, Prokofiev, and Rachmaninoff. They thought he was approaching Wagner's vision of total art. I mean, indeed, they were correct. What was that Italian version of Fantasia? I have to remember this. Allegro non troppo. Yeah, that's it. I know a lot of composers in Europe felt a little bit cheated by this because although I think when they saw this, they saw what Disney had attempted, they all realized that there was this enormous opportunity to use animation and classical music together for total art. And the problem is that no one in Europe really had the capacity to animate well enough to make a rival. And so inevitably, Fantasia had these American fingerprints on it. It's like undeniably American. And so Allegro non troppo was all of these Italians getting together in the 70s and trying to make their own version of Fantasia. And it is wild. It is very 60s. I'll say that. It is very 1960s. Blue Muggins for $25 USA. Excellent thoughts on blues. The legend Robert Johnson. The devil, the famous guy that the devil taught how to play guitar. The legend of Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil down at the crossroads is the most famous story about blues. Why do you think about this? And do you think this counts as a Faustian story the way we use the term? Well, I mean, look, this is I don't know who pointed out this observation, but it is Faustian, right? It is the ultimate Faustian story. And that just shows you that I'm going to give a big F you to all of my European listeners right now. This just shows you that Americans are the most Faustian of all the Faustian people. You know, we have you guys we have your number down. And I'll say this, Robert Johnson joins a variety of characters in American history that have one thing in common. Now, in most stories of Faust, the one by Goethe notwithstanding, what happens is Faust sells his soul to the devil for, in most stories, it is, I guess this varies, right? Sometimes early on it's like magical powers, but other times it's the ultimate experience, right? That's what creates the Faustian notion. We want to embrace the universe in all its forms. And in Goethe's version, it's like, you can't possibly give me what I want. My dissatisfaction will exceed the size of the entire universe. That was the Faustian bargain that Goethe's Faust does. But in all versions of Faust, other than Goethe, Faust always loses his soul to the devil. Right? Goethe, being the romantic he was, has Faust redeemed with some mysterious thing that's not even very understandable. But in all of the American versions, from Robert Johnson to The Devil Went Down to Georgia, like the devil comes to you with a Faustian bargain, and like you just somehow beat the devil. Like you just beat, like you're so like you're so Faustian, you take the devil's bargain and then you beat the devil at his own game, which is just like the stupidest thing. I mean, it goes against all traditional wisdom. You never make a deal with the demonic. You never make a deal with the demonic. But in the American version, you do make a deal. You just beat the devil. Uh, anyway, my sinuses are going nuts. But thank you very much. I mean, look, the story behind American music and its association with the devil is absolutely an expression of the Faustian spirit of the West, and the opposition between the moral authority of the Puritans and the devil in its music means that for Americans, music was always at the forefront of our Faustian expression of ourselves. I think in old Europe, the Faustian form was always more novels and paintings and sculptures. That was always the height of the Faustian expression. Maybe classical music to a certain degree as well. But for Americans, the cutting edge was always the music. That was always the way that we kind of communed with the devil, or no, not communed, struggled against the devil, right? Beat the devil. That's the feeling of rock and roll too, right? Like that horrible was it Jack Black fighting the devil for the greatest rock song of all time. Isaac Young, for 25, he says, I've discovered that authors seek out specific forms of music that parallel the story vision we have in our heads. I listen to music exclusively to feel out scenes and narrative beats, which has led me to listening to a lot of neo-folk, tribal, and futuristic genres. Music as a zeitgeist and as a shared culture is alien to me. Well, I mean, look, that's not uncommon too, to listen to music to feel out scenes. I have always felt that jazz music is actually pretty good for that. If you're trying to feel out a scene, then having kind of a music that sinks into the background can be quite good for that. So I might branch out. I might branch out with that a little bit, but we might talk more about that. Ben White for $3 USA. And thanks again, Isaac Young. I think I'm going to have you on the podcast at some point when I can find a slot. Ben White for $3 USA. Hi, Dave. I hope you're having a good Lent. I am. Thank you. I am actually really enjoying not being on X. Otherwise, it would depress me. This Iran thing is beyond depressing. I feel like I'm on a constant grind with all of my job and personal duties. Well, I feel like that. I feel like I work so much. I feel like I never have a spare moment. It's amazing. I can't, I sleep so little. It's amazing. I feel like everyone feels like they're just being worked to the bone and have no spare time. Even though people are saying that there's no jobs left. Like what the hell is going on here? Funny you mentioned NPR. Yeah, I wrote an entire article about NPR. My mom listened to NPR while driving me to school in violin practice. Hey, I think I literally have my violin here. Yeah, I have it right off camera. I wasn't going to talk about that, but I remember that. I listened to it into early adulthood, but I found their programming at odds with true Christian living. NPR went into steep decline in the mid 2000s until it became what it is today, which is just the most completely worthless woke shit imaginable. It is unlistenable in its modern incarnation. And so I completely sympathize with you, Ben White. It is unlistenable. Um, Thank you very much, though. Sam153 says, all the best this Lent, Dave. Thank you again. Turner Rives for the last super chat of the night says, I'll have to watch on replay. Here is my shameless plug. Check out the Turner Rives, the banjo. Check out the Turner Rives, the banjo YouTube channel for Americana and bluegrass music from somebody in the scene. Well, hey, that's great. Thank you so much. I will check that out. I have an old banjo that I used to play. I went to banjo and fiddle camp for a weekend, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to learn the banjo, and then I realized that I could just play the fiddle parts and be better at it, so I just did that. So anyway, check out Turner Rives, everybody. That sounds like a great deal. And so we are completely at time, guys. I will say, everyone, have a wonderful Lent. This is week 1 of the series. I will see you guys all next week for the installation on literature, I think. And I will look into getting permanent versions of these things uploaded afterwards. But thank you, everyone who gave me super chats. And I hope